Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I am the acting director of the Kennan Institute. And I would like to welcome you to our discussion today on the European response to Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, and to consider how the EU's most vulnerable Eastern European members can protect themselves. I want to begin by thanking the Wilson Center's Global Europe program for co-sponsoring today's event. And I encourage our audience to stay up to date with our latest Kennan publications and events by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and Russia File, as well as our podcast, Kennan X. You can also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. We'll open it up for questions later, but if you'd like to ask a question during the course of the conversation, you can submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation before sending your questions. I want to begin by briefly welcoming and introducing our three speakers. I will briefly give their bios because they're all very impressive, and then we'll begin our program. But we'll start with Dr. Marie Mendras. She is a political scientist and professor at Sciences Po, Paris in international affairs. She was a visiting scholar at Hong Kong Baptist University and in 2016-2017 at the Kennan Institute as an expert at the Wilson Center. She is the author of numerous works. I will just briefly summarize them, including Russian Politics, The Paradox of a Weak State, Russian elites worry, The Unpredictability of Putinism, and Putin-Biden, a double-edged summit. Our next speaker will be Andrew Monaghan. He is a research analyst in the field of international politics. He is a non-resident associate fellow at the NATO Defense College and commissioning editor of the NDC's Russian Studies series. He is the author of several books, including Dealing with the Russians, Power in Modern Russia, and The New Politics of Russia. He began his education at the University of Edinburgh and received his PhD and MA at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London. Our final speaker to this morning is Andrius Kubilius. He is the secretary in charge of the Lithuanian pro-independence. He was the secretary in charge of the Lithuanian pro-independence movement, Sąjūdis. He served as Prime Minister twice of Lithuania, and he is currently a European member of the European Parliament and is head of the chairman of various parliamentary groups, and we are very pleased that he could join us this morning. So without further ado, we're going to begin with our discussion, and I'll turn the program over to Dr. Mendras. Marie.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Thank you very much, Will, for this invitation. It is great to be back at the Kennan, even remotely. Very glad to be together with Andrew and Andrius. We have about 10 minutes each to get started, and I hope we get many comments and questions. We have little time, so I want to start with the experience we've been having in the last few weeks and in the last 7 days, and then move on to a more analytical contribution. On Thursday, very early morning in Paris, I woke up 4 o'clock just as they were starting the invasion. for some strange reason, but it happened. And immediately I rang friends in Kiev, and my friend Deputy Grigori Nemiria, who served as Minister for European Affairs some years ago in Ukraine. Clearly, he and others had not anticipated a full invasion of Ukraine. We'll come back to this, the lack of anticipation in Ukraine and in most European countries, and of course in Russia as well. I don't even think that Putin's close circle was quite aware of what why they had to stick with him and go for this kind of monstrous war against civilians. So I asked Grigori Nemiria, what can we do? He gave me 4 missions. And we are actually fulfilling those 4 missions. The one thing he said, make sure that the European Union offers Ukraine a rapid accession to the EU. You're all aware that this is happening. Ursula von der Leyen's speech a few days ago, this is on the way. The second, he said, go and look for resolution 377A of the United Nations, and you'll see how in 1950, the UN General Assembly managed to vote in the on the Korea question without stopping at the veto at the Security Council. We did that as well. There was a huge majority for Ukraine against the Russian invasion at the General Assembly of the UN. Only 5 countries, not even 10 or 12 as usual, voted with Russia. Third task Nemiria gave us, International Criminal Court. That's on the way as well. And fourth, arms. You cannot fight with us, you can have boots on the ground, but at long last, please help us resist and defend our country and our people. I insist on this because we have been very late in Europe, in NATO, but now we are, I think, doing as best as we can. It could be a little better, maybe a little more efficient, but I do not see, maybe Andrius Kubilius, Andrew Monaghan will contradict me on this, but I don't see today major differences between governments or between EU, NATO. There is a huge consensus. Maybe later in the discussion, we can go into why we misanalyzed Putin's foreign defense internal policies. I don't want to spend too many minutes on this, but of course I have a lot to say, in particular about the French, not only misperceptions, but misjudgment about what I call the Russian crisis. And as Will and Andrew know very well, I've been writing about this, the crisis of the Russian system, of the power system of Putin, the clan, the corruption, the violence, etc., since the second war in Chechnya which means when Putin came to power, thanks to the second war in Chechnya. So it all started with a huge war crime and quasi genocide. My second point is, it is not a Ukrainian crisis, it is a Russia crisis. I have been writing also about this, and many of other good scholars and experts for years. There is no Ukrainian crisis. There is a crisis of the Russian system of power. There is a huge problem with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But our arguments could not be heard properly because of loaded interests and games, political, economic, industrial games in most of our countries. And also because most of experts, politicians were really stuck with an obsolete paradigm of what Russia's foreign and defense policies were. And so what I hope very much is that in a few weeks, when we have a little more time, we are not overwhelmed by the emergency situation, that we don't forget what we've been going through. We don't forget the misjudgments, the indulgence, benevolence towards Putin, and that we actually start working on new, more serious basis of international security and how we deal with the security of the in-between states, the states that are stuck between Putin's system and Europe, between Putin's system and NATO and the West. So I think that will be a second time, and I hope we can have another conference where then we have time to look back at the beginning of this war and go into this. Why do I insist on this now? That we have understudied the Russia crisis and we have focused on Ukraine, and in a way, consciously or not, put some responsibility on Ukraine as a victim. It is often the subtext. It was the subtext, certainly in France, and I'll be interested to know about the United Kingdom and Germany, and so we have a Russia crisis. It's now, unfortunately, for everyone to see clearly that it is a system of rule that has greatly deteriorated in recent years, certainly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine in the spring of 2014, with the role of one man, hypertrophied in a way, and leading to a grave deterioration of Putin's personality judgment. I'm sure all of us have, adjectives and clinical diagnosis of his state of mind. What is more important is to study, which we can do, and I know Andrew has been studying this very much too, is the functioning of the ruling elites, that is the clans, the organs, the friends, the oligarchs around the head of state or the head of the clanic system. And we all watched this incredible, horrific theater on Monday, 10 days ago, when Putin met with the members of his Security Council. And it was absolutely clear to all of us that he was taking hostage, in a way, his clan and say, you're gonna go in that with me. You cannot now say no. And if I fall, you fall. And this is, I think, how we should analyze what's happening. As I don't know, I think I can dare say it, a suicide or a fall. It may take a long time. It may be short. We don't know. But this will not only be determined by how well or how poorly the Russian army fares in Ukraine. What will be absolutely key is what actually happens in Russia. People are now getting extremely worried. Protest against the war is very real. Of course, in the limits of what you can do in a dictatorship, but we know that amongst ruling circles and oligarchs, there are big cracks already. This is a key matter to follow. And of course, the other a key question is Ukrainian resistance capacity to fight back. When Grigory Nemeria told me on the 24th, early morning, we need to have this rapid accession to the EU as an end of the tunnel for the 45 million Ukrainians. If we don't give them the perspective that it's worth fighting and that they can rebuild their country, be safe and prosperous, then they will do it. And I think if there's a message that is really most important to send the Ukrainians and also the people in Russia who understand what's happening, this is absolutely key. Just one example: tomorrow, Saturday, 3 p.m. in Paris, very center of Paris, the Russians of France are organizing a massive demonstration with the Ukrainians of France and all of us. So we now, at long last, can say and write, no, the despot is never popular when he resorts to violence inside and outside his country.
Thank you very much, Marie. Andrew.
Thank you, Will. It's good to join you all on the panel. And having recently joined the Kennan Institute as a Kennan Fellow, I must say one of the things that has been going through my mind while I've been here is I wonder what George Kennan would have made of all this. As I would like to try to contribute to the discussion here, I want to perhaps shift the angle a little bit to talk a bit about Russian military strategy, Russian ground strategy, Russian military strategy. That in that way that we can perhaps contextualize our thinking about responses. There's much I would agree with, obviously, with Marie. I think it's absolutely right that we've not analyzed the Russian Federation very well for many years in a number of ways. Perhaps the most important two ways are that we have said that the Russian leadership does not have a strategy. It's been very visible, and one of the reasons why power has been able to be created over the last 20 years, and why we are now, is indeed because the Russian leadership has sought to generate strategy, grand strategy even. But second, we've preferred to talk about measures short of war, about asymmetry, about how Russia would not use the military tool. Somewhat surprisingly, again, echoing the point about Russian grand strategy, somewhat blind to Russian activity, where decisive military force was used at Debaltseve in 2015. As the Russians themselves say, significant combat power deployed to Syria, and so on. But we've still tended to focus on Russia's measures short of war. So although the Russian leadership tends to talk in terms of a special operation, what I'd like to do perhaps is contextualize a little bit what Moscow means by war, and how this has been dissonant with what we have thought of in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic community about how we've understood this. So really two points for my remarks, and hopefully we'll get onto this much more in the question and answer and discussion session. If you will, our first mistake in some senses was to misread the Russian military statements in 2013, particularly early 2013, which was that the Russian leadership had formed a new way of war that was sub-threshold, that talked down kinetic force, that measures short of war were the conclusion of a discussion, extended discussion, that they had arrived at in 2013, and that Crimea and the annexation of Crimea and the use of proxies and others and political subversion was now a new form of warfare. This is a mistake because, in fact, actually the Russian military, both officially and in expert circles, were still considering and rediscussing and discussing again and debating what the changing character of war is. A permanent feature of Russian military sciences is the debate about the changing character of war and how the trajectory goes between through the arc of history into the arc of the future. And I'll come to this in a second. But so rather than conclude that there was a new measure of war, in fact, the Russian leadership continued with this discussion. And towards the end of the 2010s, there was considerable. Throughout the 2010s, really, you have a view in the Russian leadership that actually armed force was really an important element of strategic and international affairs, that war and armed aggression was becoming ever more central to international affairs, that war itself was becoming dynamic and fast-flowing, and planetary in scope. So there's much discussion, for instance, of what we would understand perhaps as network-centric warfare, but particularly focused on the United States' approach of global strike, the ability to deploy force, knockout force, one blow knockout style force, almost anywhere in the world, and spoken of in terms of 21st century blitzkrieg. Now, I mean, just to point you in the direction, this is quoting Gerasimov from the mid-decade, 21st century blitzkrieg. And as many of you who follow Russian politics, Russian military, Russian history will know, really the centerpiece for Russian thinking about war is the Great Patriotic War. Even in 2014, you have articles from very senior figures pointing out the relevance of understanding the Great Patriotic War to events that happened in 2014. So important historical context that we see two ways. First, that centrality of what large war, or what a particularly large state-to-state war might look like, but also the sense of how war is conducted, that sense of blitzkrieg featuring prominently in Russian military thinking. And as a result, so the Russian military and defense community were redefining what military strategy meant from about 2019. So having discussed and thought through what war is, they were discussing again what military strategy might look like. And why strategy is important, because not only were the documents shaped, not only was there debate underway and there was document being shaped, but the Russian defense, political and economic landscape was shifting in accordance with this. So we see the establishment and opening of the National Defense Management Center in 2014, the reorganization of air defense and aerospace forces and into the aerospace force in 2015, the establishment of Rosgvardia in 2016 and its building from there, but also the re-equipment, reform and rehearsal of armed forces and their use in extensive exercising since the early decades. So, and again, none of this can come as a surprise, because as many pointed out, or some pointed out, the Russian military procurement list was for firepower. So the Russian military, at the same time we were talking that the Russian military was moving away from firepower, the Russian military was buying something like 2,000 tanks, 2,300 pieces of self-propelled artillery, and so on and so forth, ships, planes, and the like. And then practicing how to move and organize and deploy these forces, including the whole of state. Of course, strategy, as everyone knows, in every country and throughout history, strategy is difficult and complicated, and the Russian military leadership has faced typical problems not only in terms of trying to understand and cope with the adversary in a difficult international environment, but also within its own system. Because strategy really is about coordinating your own orchestra, conducting your own orchestra. And the Russian landscape, the Russian policy landscape is very rarely harmonious. And as I think we're seeing, I mean, today, but there's been an extended problem in practice about how do you manage command and control. This is a permanent feature of Russian military history, the difficulties of command and control and logistics. And indeed, we're seeing that again. So very briefly, just to say, 3 types of strategy were set out by Gerasimov in 2019: territorial defense, strategy of limited operations, which is similar to expeditionary operations, and active defense. So there has been considerable effort put into military strategic thought over the last decade that has prepared in some senses for measures of war. But I do think that given the current situation, given the discussion of special operation and so on, given that we now must be really talking about measures of war, let's just have a brief thought about what war is and how it's understood by the Russian military, indeed by the Russian state as a whole. Because this is an important distinction between measures short of war and measures of war. And in some sense, it's very obvious. It's the old Clausewitzian idea of a policy clash. In order to resolve a policy clash, it's the use of armed force to resolve a policy clash. And its characteristic is always armed force. The Russian military then divides war up into generations and periods. So, for instance, periods of war, periodization of war, threatening period of war before the war begins, where you prepare and organize your forces. The initial period of war, which is perhaps 6 to 12, 6 to 14 days, where you try to seize the advantage in decisive operations, and then subsequent periods, the following periods, and then the final period. Most important, perhaps, for I think our consideration today, although that periodization is essential, are the levels of war, and there are 5, but we'll focus here on 3. The first is a local war, and this is defined in Russian military thinking as a war that pursues limited military political objectives, when military actions take place within the borders of the warring states themselves and affecting mainly the interests, territorial, economic, political, of these states. We then have a regional and large-scale war, which I'll come to in a second, but we are somewhere, therefore, between a special operation, which seems to me a fudge for not using the word war, but in essence a local war, and that means conventional ground forces war that is between Russia and Ukraine. And this helps us to understand the contextualization of the use of nuclear deterrence in the initial statement, but it also helps us to understand the 2 further stages beyond that, which is a regional war, which involves several states in the same region, so the Euro-Atlantic region, waged by national or coalition armed force, in the course of which the sides are pursuing important political military objectives. And crucially, because this helps us to understand escalation, the kinds of weapons used and so on, a large-scale war, which is a war between coalitions of states or major states of the world community, in which the sides are pursuing radical political military objectives. And this may be the result of an escalation of a regional or local war. It also involves strategic weaponry. So we understand, therefore, roughly where we are in Russian military thinking. This provides us with something of a spectrum in how you might understand victory and defeat here. Again, shaped through Russian military thinking. Victory is understood as the permanent resolution of the policy dispute with an international treaty. But you have a spectrum where there is political victory, which is at the one end, followed by military victory, and then down through the spectrum to military defeat and political defeat. Now, what's interesting and important about this is to bear in mind that the Russian military has quite often been defeated on the battlefield at a local, in a local way. But what we talk about, we distinguish that between military defeat and political defeat, which is polny razgrom, the collapse of the state. And that is where the Russian leadership has often pointed to World War I as the example of this. So what we're talking about, the difference between military defeat and political defeat, is essentially the question of an existential struggle. So in conclusion, I must in the end agree with Marie that this is the question of a Russia challenge and how we deal with this. It is an era of global power competition. I would observe that we started talking about great power competition in 2017. The Russian leadership explicitly came to this conclusion in 2007. if not a year or two before, implicitly. But we are in an era of global power competition. And I think this concept of challenges us to think in bigger terms beyond the immediate future. For the last how many months we have been thinking in terms of imminence. Will they, won't they attack? Will they, won't they attack? Because we've lost contact, as Marie said, with what's going on in Russian thinking and planning and contextualization. And we've been thinking imminence all the time. We might even say that the raising of the nuclear weapon suddenly meant that futures is not something that we do. But we must indeed be doing, quite to the contrary, thinking through foresight. And I don't mean prediction, I mean foresight, which is a complex and difficult activity that takes us through already to June, December, then 2024, then 2027. So as always, before we act, we have to diagnose where we are and where we think we're heading, because otherwise the measures that we do will be responsive measures that do not take us where we need to be going. And I will say on that note, it remains, while it's a pleasure and an honor to address and be part of the Kennan Institute, it's a great sadness that it has to be under these circumstances. Will, thank you for your patience as I spoke for a bit too long.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Just a reminder that we will be going to questions, and we've already received several. But if you want to submit a question, you can do so via email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, really. It's a privilege and honor to participate in this seminar of, Kennan Institute. Definitely, we know what George Kennan was doing, and in my personal biography, I am very proud that back in 2007, being still in Lithuanian National Parliament, we spent some time and we wrote Russia containment strategy. That was one of things which allowed us to focus our mind, what we need to do. Now, really, I would say that starting to discuss this, what is on agenda, I would mention also that I am here in the European Parliament. I'm standing rapporteur on Russia, and we prepared, back last year in September, it was approved by European Parliament special report on EU policy towards Russia, which at least in Russian audience, in Russian liberal audience, got quite a lot of discussion, and Kremlin was very angry on that report. So that is what is from where some of my ideas are coming. And last point, that also when I came into European Parliament back in 2019, we created so-called informal forum of the Friends of European Russia, and pandemic helped us, since we started to do it online. And then, really, we were very happy to see Marie quite often, as a speaker or participant on those forums. So we had a possibility to develop our understanding of, what is going on. And of course, Ukraine for me is, since I am from Lithuania, Ukraine for us is something historically very close. We had been part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and Ukrainians sometimes are dreaming to come back to that period of time. So that's where we are now. Coming to the, I will try to spend a few minutes on European response to this, to Putin war, which is really something very crazy, and mad and very cruel. But what we see really is that, in introduction, I can say just a few words about, Ukraine, Russia, and European Union. So Ukraine really is showing that this is, I would call strongest European nation, which is fighting for European values since 2014. We can call in one war, in two wars, whatever. But that is, what makes, us to admire them, and fights in a very successful way. And sometimes I am saying that, it's not that Ukraine should ask for NATO membership. It's NATO should ask, Ukraine to join, because that would strengthen NATO as you know, as military alliance, you know, because really they are showing some kind of incredible military capabilities, and knowing lack of weapons and so on. This is remarkable. Now, second, on Russia, really, I will not continue too much, but I see, I don't know, it's as Marie perhaps have said, you know, it's we need to ask, you know, medical doctors of, you know, psychiatry or whatever, you know, to make a diagnosis, because to understand, you know, using some kind of rational approach, it's impossible. Why Putin decided, what was the reason behind? It's impossible. And really, you know, and I see, I'm calling this, you know, that I see really beginning, you know, of the end of Putinism in Russia. And the losses which they are facing now, while you know, just before you know, this seminar, I just looked, you know, into Wikipedia, you know, and for very simple numbers, how much, you know, how many, you know, losses they had, for example, during Afghanistan war. At least Wikipedia, I don't know if they are putting, you know, real numbers, but they're showing that during 10 years of Afghan war, Soviets lost less than 15,000 soldiers who were killed in the battle, you know. So now Ukrainian Defense Ministry, they are declaring that, you know, during 1 week, 9,000 of Russian soldiers were killed in the battlefield. 9,000. 1 week, and Afghan 10 years, you know. Now in Afghanistan war, you know, Soviets lost 147 tanks. Now, you know, in the battles, you know, on Ukrainian fields, they lost more than 200 tanks during 1 week. So I think that it really, if you look and to compare, you know, of course, there are perhaps different reasons, different wars and so on. But if you are looking into the losses, which Russians are you know, are getting, you know, in this war, I think that, you know, really, it's, for me, it means, you know, it's an end of Putinism in Russia. I don't know how it will come, what will happen, but I see, you know, that this is really that tendency. Now, the last point on Europe, on EU, you know, and I agree with, you know, perhaps it was Charles Michel who you know, during our plenary sitting, you know, special plenary meeting of European Parliament on Tuesday, he said, well, this is how European Union is born as a real geopolitical body. What European Union managed to achieve, you know, during this week, yeah, it's pity that, you know, they did not manage to do that before, you know, 2 weeks ago, before the war started. But with delivery of weapons, with sanctions, with everything else, it's really something which we were not able to expect, and that is what you know, what really shows for me that really what we are saying in a some kind of metaphorical, you know, way, that this war, you know, will change the whole world. So really, I see that Russia will be different, Ukraine will be different, and EU will be different, you know, after the war. So that's my understanding. Now on a little bit more on details and you know, and some kind of, you know, thoughts what is needed to be done next. I will not continue too long, you know, but first of all, I will start with the support to Ukraine. So you know that, you know, EU member states started to deliver weapons. Of course, Americans and Brits are perhaps, you know, making much more of that, but it's good that Europeans also started to do that. Even Germans, it's again, you know, something which we were not able to expect. And I would say that I see two reasons why you know, the mind is changing. First of all, you know, that everybody started to see that Ukrainians are so good in battlefield, you know, that, you know, even some reluctant European capitals want to be on the side of winners, you know, and not and not to be blamed after that, you know, that you were not together. Second, of course, very strong public support. You know, to Ukrainians, what we see, all the demonstrations, you know, that is also making big impact. So member states started to deliver weapons. first time, you know, EU starts to use this, you know, European Peace Facility or Peace Foundation. I don't know how it's called correctly, but it's around of, you know, 450 million euros, which will be used exactly to buy and to deliver weapons to Ukraine. So this is again something what never was expected. Then, in addition to that, EU provided 1.2 billion, you know, macro financial assistance immediately. You know, last week we voted, and this is good. And now we are speaking about the creation of special fund, which we call Free Ukraine Fund. It's, I don't know what amount of money will be needed. We are looking for the fund which would, you know, assist Ukraine to rebuild, to restore, you know, economy after the war will be finished, to restore all the infrastructure. Polish Prime Minister also named the number, but perhaps without any precise calculations, you know, 100 billion. And that is what we are looking for. And Joseph Borrell, whom I would praise also, you know, and I could even, you know, publicly apologize that earlier I was quite critical about his, you know, job. Now I see really him as a strong leader, you know, in bringing, you know, consensus among member states. So he proposed, and we are now elaborating exactly that idea, that to use some kind of this, you know, financial engineering instruments which were created in EU when you know, at the beginning of pandemic, EU established so-called recovery fund with, you know, hundreds of billions, and when the first time EU went into the markets to borrow, you know, on EU, you know, behalf. So this is what we are looking now, how to use some kind of this practice to establish a new fund, Free Ukraine Fund, in order really to assist Ukrainian recovery. And of course, the last point where how we are supporting Ukraine is what we did in the resolution on Tuesday, when on Monday President Zelensky, whom we can praise also, you know, of his leadership, when he officially asked, you know, to start procedures of Ukrainian, you know, membership in EU. On Tuesday in the parliament we voted and we asked EU institutions to give so-called candidate status for Ukraine, which is the first step in that process of, you know, of getting membership. Normally membership procedures are quite long. We, as for example, as Lithuania, we went, it was 10 years procedures for us to negotiate, to improve ourselves, to integrate and so on. We put formal application, what was done by Zelensky, you know, on Monday. We put that application in 1995 and we got membership in 2004. So now we are looking how to make a special procedure for Ukraine. No, not to, you know, not to go through all that traditional one, you know, 10 years or whatever. After Ukraine will become candidate status, we're looking for special procedure. Of course, that will take time to see how we can do some kind of special procedure. I'm not so sure that we shall manage, but I immediately, and I put small paper on trying to remind everybody that here was one example when one country or one territory, you know, became a member of EU during 1 year. And that was Eastern Germany, so-called DDR, you know, after Berlin Wall collapsed. So it took for them less than 1 year, not only to reunify, you know, with Western Germany, but also to become member of EU. Sometimes I was joking before to Ukrainians before the war. Now jokes are not so acceptable maybe, but I was joking that if you will be really stuck in integration towards EU, we could, you know, re-establish Grand Duchy of Lithuania. You know, Ukraine would join Lithuania as eastern part of Germany, you know, joined Western Germany, and that is how you can become again, you know, member of EU. Of course, that is a joke, but something we need to be creative in order to look how to make, you know, some kind of special procedure. Now, second point is what EU does with sanctions on Russia. And again, those sanctions are quite heavy, as you know. And really, it's amazing that EU was able to agree quite rapidly. Okay, part of sanctions were prepared before. There were those, sanctions which were agreed in between with Americans, with Canadians, with Brits, and which were used to try to convince Putin not to go into the war. But when the war started, those sanctions, of course, they were applied, but also some other sanctions were added. And of course, most painful sanction is against central bank and its reserves, Russian central bank and reserves. Russian national currency ruble is very heavily hit. If you look into so-called credit default swaps, again, you can see that Russian financial system is really under very big pressure, and the numbers are growing up, and it looks like that financial system is quite not far away from I would call red lights of bankruptcy. Second, of course, SWIFT sanctions, which unfortunately for time being are only partial. Some banks are not included into this sanction list, such as Sberbank and Gazprom. I will tell why. But some of the banks really also are hit by this, SWIFT sanctions. Sanctions on high tech are very painful to Russia, and not even what EU or Americans are doing. But I was positively surprised that teeny Taiwan, made decision on sanctions on processors for computers, and at least while reading Russian press, I understood that those can be, most painful, because Russians were very much dependent. They are not producing themselves; they are buying, importing those processors. And when Taiwan declared that they are closing, I saw some articles which are showing that it's really painful. Personal sanctions. It's partially amazing that during one day, Putin and Lavrov was put onto sanction list, which was never, Europe is very good in bureaucracy and usually takes, weeks and months to decide. Now those two were included, and I saw immediately how oligarchs started to be very nervous, that they can be included also during one day. Tribunal also is going around. There are governments and there are, who are joining this initiative, and that perhaps also is very clear. Now, what is still missing, and we are pushing here in European Parliament on very clear embargo on oil and gas, not to buy any more oil and gas from Russia. Of course, the question is how Europe can survive, but at least what we hear from Commission President that with assistance of the United States, now Europe is ready to survive during this season. Next season we can be, more before next season we can be more prepared. Now, why we need to make an embargo? Because really we're paying still very big money, to Russians each day. I calculated, looking into official data, I just calculated, how much we're paying per day. And I got new numbers, how much we were paying in 2021. So we paid during 2021, the whole year, it's 99 billion euros. When Russian military spending, it's 60 billion. And if you calculate how much we're paying per day, so roughly we're paying around of 270 million euros per day, each day, while we are buying oil and gas. And if to consider that Russian tank, not the most modern, T-72, costs around of 1.5 million euros. So per day we're buying 180 new tanks for Putin. So this is more or less, how much tanks Ukrainians are able to destroy during 3 days. So it takes 3 days for brave Ukrainian soldiers to destroy 160 or 180 tanks, and we are paying Europeans only. We are paying during one day exactly such an amount of money, which covers which Russians can use to buy the same amount of tanks. So this is what we need to do. And this is what would allow also then, if we shall make embargo, it will allow us also to kick out all the Russian banks from SWIFT, because now some of the banks are left, without this sanction, because they are needed for Europeans to pay, for Russian gas and all. So I stop here. So still we have what to do, but really I am quite proud what Europe managed to achieve, and of course I am very proud of Ukrainians who are strongest Europeans and bravest soldiers on the European continent.
Thank you, Andrius. And we're going to go to your questions, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask a few questions myself. And I want to begin with Marie. And I would like Marie to just articulate more about the misjudgment and mishandling of the French approach to Russia in the lead up to this crisis. What do you think were the mistakes? And obviously, many countries have mistakes that need to be reassessed. But from your perspective, what were France's major mistakes leading up to this crisis?
Yes, Will, I will do that, but I'd like to stress that unfortunately France is not a special case. And
yes,
also,
yes,
and I would like to tell you that I think Andrew and Andrius and I would very much like you and all the excellent experts and scholars who are listening to us to explain the US position since last August. I think it is important also to see why the US administration's very pointed analysis and foresight and and forecasting of what was going to happen could not be taken in by the Ukrainians or many in Europe. I think it is a key question. The problem is not only to be right, thanks to fantastic capacity in intelligence, but why did it not work? I mean, the communication of this essential information that was lost in subversion and fake news. I think this is where we all, Western nations, have failed. And we can't just blame the Ukrainians for, being in a form of denial, because I think most of us simply could not conceive a barbaric war that is not even declared as a war. And there is something that shows how sane the Ukrainians are about life and death, and how sane we are. So because we could not conceive, we could not quite prepare. And just because I was with you at the Canon when Trump was elected, I remember very well how most American friends and colleagues were in denial of the reality of what was in the making. So really, it's a question if what one or several of you can, if we can start a discussion about the lack of capacity to take in US and NATO intelligence. About the French position, as I wrote in several articles, and there are several problems with the French political, economic, industrial elites, and to some extent with French media as well, because media follow the wind because of the way they work now in this internet ocean, and a mix of disinformation, fake narratives, fake analysis, lots of big emotions, no time for factual evidence and reasoning. So there is the old story of the French romantic narrative about Franco-German friendship traditions. I've been fighting against this for years and years to no avail. Maybe a horrific war of Russians against Ukrainians might stop this in France, but I'm not completely sure. And this is what I'm worried about. And I'd like also Andrew to say a little more about the situation in the UK, because after 8 days of war, now we have to prepare for more than a blitzkrieg. I see, the old habits come back in many comments. So the second problem is in France is the same as in Germany, for example, but also other smaller states like Hungary, Slovakia, is of course the might of the gas industry, banks, political lobbies. Lobbies are very, very strong in France, but also in Brussels, Andrius, very, very powerful. And they've been working very, very effectively in support of the Putin kleptocracy and against Ukraine. It is continuing to present Ukraine as a badly run country, still corrupt, with no army, who could not do anything with Donbass or Crimea, and who were less developed than Russia. So this fake narrative is still on. And just last week, I was still on TV shows, programs, talks, where you had a senator or a deputy or a big industry representative have the nerve to say that Ukrainians simply didn't really count. But I wouldn't say this is specifically French. Mind you, in French public opinion, in French society, the understanding of what the Putin regime is has been much more proper. Much more proper than among the elite. Finally, on Emmanuel Macron himself, you've been following this. He's been making mistakes. Yes, when he came to the presidency, as you remember, his campaign had been also attacked by trolls and subversion, and but he forgot it too easily because he got into this French political, economic world of interests. And also because many were telling him that Ukraine, as much as Georgia, Moldova, that are smaller countries, will remain in a gray zone of a form of dependence on Moscow. And this is what I really denounce in French policies, but not only in the French, but I'm speaking now about my own country, is that for so many years, since even the Orange Revolution, even though we had signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, that was the idea that it was more comfortable for us, the French, the Germans, Europe, NATO, to believe that we could trust the security of Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova to Putin's Russia. So now Emmanuel Macron spoke yesterday night, he spoke very well. And now he has the right analysis. Putin is the threat. His regime is the threat. And Ukraine, as much as Georgia, Moldova, Belarus, one day when they get rid of the dictator, will be in the same security space as all other European countries. And tonight, Emmanuel Macron will be declaring he is a candidate. And in fact, I will be commenting after this on television. And I am now absolutely sure that he, Emmanuel Macron, is capable of understanding what went wrong and going for a policy that is both short-term, medium-term, and long-term. This is the most important. We never had, the right timeline in our policies. And also, even more important, that now Emmanuel Macron and his government and most of the political class in France understand that there's no reason to go for a national policy of France. We have to go European, NATO, transatlantic, UN. This is what is working. So I'm rather positive, but in the meantime, the Ukrainians are the victims.
Thank you, Marie. I will skip the question about the American approach because I want to get let the panelists respond. So I will pass on that one, but we can obviously talk about that later. But I think Marie asked a direct question for Andrew as well.
Yes, thank you, Marie. The situation in the UK. Well, in fact, I had a conversation with the Kennan Institute on UK-Russia relations in October, at which the question was posed: is this likely to get any better or any worse? Unfortunately, our conclusion at the time in October was that no. Unfortunately, it's difficult to see how it might improve, and yes, it's possible to see how it might deteriorate. Let me offer a couple of points on the UK point with regards to this. It's pretty clear to all that have an institutional memory about watching Russia that London and Moscow have barely had a relationship since 2006 when Litvinenko was murdered. In fact, London has not played a substantive role in many of the questions that we've had since. Yes, there was an attempt to rethink policy towards Russia in the early 2010s. Yes, there was involvement in 2014 about sanctions and so on. And yes, there was some coordination after the Skripal attack in 2018. But London was not part of the Normandy process or the Minsk agreements and Normandy process. London has not been part of a number of other questions. And then really, actually, since November, the British leadership has become much more active in its Russia question, and one wonders the extent to which this has a clear goal in mind. Certainly, there's a great deal of support for Ukraine, understandably, in many ways, but the trip of our Foreign Secretary and then Defense Secretary to Moscow, to my mind, is something that actually London should have been doing a little bit earlier, in my view, and in fact would be worth somehow continuing, because while we're doing this, it seems to me important that there is at least some form of channel open to Moscow to continue a dialogue. That will be very difficult given the recent, not just the outbreak of, let's call it the blurring between special military operation and local war. Not just because that makes it difficult, but because, in fact, of the nature of diplomacy that went up to it, with the specific statements that no, from Russian officials, no, Russia is not going to go to war. So it will be very difficult to have a formulated conversation. But if there is no sense of discussion, then miscalculation becomes very, very easy. And we immediately start to move into the terrain for unplanned for miscalculation and escalation. So it seems to me essential that there is some kind of dialogue. It seems to me we can have an extended conversation about the United States, should you wish, on a different panel, and will be doing the answering of the questions there. But actually, in that sense, the US has maintained a pretty clear line. And I think London also maintains a pretty clear line about some of the questions, the specifics about how far it is possible to involve one's support for Ukraine. But also the limits to that, the idea of a no-fly zone, for instance, Because let's be quite clear about this, that escalation in that sense soon becomes synonymous with World War III. And actually some of our senior leaders are talking in those terms. So we do have to have a clear idea of where it is we want to go. Now, it's not my position here to throw rocks at the UK. This is not my intention at all. I'd much rather try to clarify what I think the Russian leadership is doing, so an effective idea can be shaped about the strategy, even could be shaped for responding. But I will say that one of the things that we have done, and one of the dangers that we're undergoing now, is a creation of groupthink, a lack of institutional memory, and too many other priorities. So lots of money can be talked about, yes. Seem to remember we've just got through, or we're just getting through COVID. Huge impact on our economies. We also have, the UK has other questions that it's had to deal with, whether one likes it or not, over the last few years, Brexit and Scotland and so on. France, Marie, you can speak for the other questions that the French leadership has to deal with. This is not an excuse, it's an obvious statement for those who've been involved in policy making, that Ukraine and Russia were not necessarily the #1 problems. But in our thinking, we've often allowed wishful thinking to take shape. So we have often mainstreamed black swans. I don't need to tell either Marie or Will or Andrius how often we have talked about the end of Putin since 2005. I don't need to remind you of this. Okay, we're now in 2022. Please remember this. So we have often mainlined black swans into our future scenarios. And black swans, as you know, are highly unlikely, highly unpredictable strategic events. And that's been our core scenario, because that's sort of what people have wanted to see. I'm sorry to have to remind you, but there are other things called grey rhinos, which are the long-term things that head towards us that we would just prefer to not look at. I began my structured remarks by observing we've talked long about Russian measures short of war, when frankly, come 2015, we should have been talking about Russian measures of war. But we don't use the W word in Europe. So, I mean, there is a practical answer to your question, Marie, that priorities abound for a government in the UK or Paris, I mean, frankly, the US too, let's face it. But there is also a thinking problem, which is based off the lack of institutional memory, which is based on somewhat wishful thinking and a reluctance to grasp the challenge. And a reluctance to grasp the challenge was very clear in our discussion, even in NATO 2030, for instance, future thinking, and some of our own, the UK and US, was to say, Russia is a challenge for the foreseeable future, but it faces inevitable socioeconomic decline, so that it seeks reconciliation with us. I mean, we probably remember from our political theory classes what bleak socioeconomic outlook driving inevitable change, where that comes from. It's an interesting way of thinking about foresight, but that's where we've been. And that's I think, our core problem, a refusal to look, dare I say it, facts in the face. Will.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And we're going to go to our questions from our audience. And the first question is dealing with the issue of international law enforcement, and whether the panelists think that an investigation into Putin and his followers under international law is viable, and whether it will happen. To what extent, in other words, to what extent will the International Criminal Court or other international law institutions try to follow up on various acts of war and human rights violations that have been committed by the Russian Federation?
Well, I can try to say a few words. Definitely, what we are facing. We're facing really criminal war, and which is going against all the United Nations Charter and all the other obligations. So I would say, from my point of view, it's very clear that real international tribunal investigation is very much needed, and I hope that democratic community will arrange that. Because I do not see any. Well, it's different from. I would not agree with Andrew that we we are not right, we are not correct when we're talking about the end of Putinism. I think that this is really what is coming, and definitely, you know, here will be obligation even for democratic community to speak out in a very clear way on all the crimes which were done. Why I'm talking that? Because again, I am coming back a little bit to the you know, previous question. I think what was our in some kind of mistake that we were too much looking into what I would call, you know, possibilities of dialogue with Putin personally. You know, listening to his, you know, statements, which, you know, it's in some way it was nonsense, because he is not speaking really what is in his mind, you know. Even his historical lectures about Ukraine, whatever, you know, we are trying to investigate sometimes too seriously. I think that the biggest, you know, the biggest worry inside of Putin was that he, perhaps better than we, you know, he understood what are historical processes in this, you know, territory which he was running. His post-imperial, you know, power was declining, and he was feeling that in a very clear way. And for him, you know, the biggest interest was how to keep his power. When he saw that people around, you know, in Belarus, for example, are going to uprisal, in Kazakhstan, they are going to uprisal, you know. So he, from one side, he was very much afraid of Navalny. I mean, he saw this as a symbol, you know. He sent Navalny into the prison because he understood very well. People are not anymore loyal to him. That was his, you know, biggest challenge. People around, you know, in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, they were, you know, also going, you know, making big and bigger different distance from Moscow, you know. So he was really feeling that this is his declining power now. I don't know what pushed him to go to this, you know, totally crazy war. I don't know. It's still, you know, I would say that, you know, we are sometimes trying to look into our mistakes, what we missed, you know, where our thinking was wrong, you know. I would say that it would be very interesting to ask ourselves where Putin, you know, went wrong in his understanding of the situation. You know, because really now it's very clear that he miscalculated. He is losing in Ukraine. He managed to achieve, you know, unity of the West, which never was, you know, shown in such a way as now we're showing. And definitely, you know, in my view, this is historical process, you know, in this, you know, post-imperial territory. And I don't see how things can come back, you know, for him to reestablish his power. And that is why I'm pretty sure that, you know, we shall see collapse of this regime, and then international tribunal will be very much realistic.
Will,
Andrew, yes.
do you mind? Sorry, if I just two-fingered.
Brief comments from Andrew and Marie, but I want to try to get to as many questions as possible.
I understand. It's merely a clarification of what I said. I mean, obviously, answering Marie's question meant that I was answering Marie's question. I'm sure that Andrius heard me right. I didn't say we're not going to see the end of Putin. I said we've been talking about the end of Putin since 2005. And I'm sorry to sound academically semantic here, but you know, it's a contentious and difficult time. I want to be explicit and clear. We've been talking about this since 2005. That's what I said. It may happen, it may not. I just observed this. Second, please bear in mind, one and all, on the call, that when we talk about the collapse of the current Russian leadership, what we are talking about, from their point of view, is an escalation to an existential challenge. I offer that because that's clearly what it would be. And that understands when we talk about it in this sense, whether Andrius and others think this is a good idea or not, this will have serious ramifications for what happens in Russia and for our relationship in it. So I only put my two fingers up there, Will, for clarification purposes. That's a longer discussion, but you're right, there are more questions.
Just to bring in Marie on this question, though, a collapse of Putin and Putin's power, would that also entail the collapse of the system of power that has governed Russia for decades, and one could argue centuries? What does the collapse of state power mean for Russia, and what do we need to be concerned about if that is happening?
Yeah, this is a very broad question. Would you want to take in a few more questions together? So I'm just afraid, I mean, if you have,
Okay.
If not, let's go into this.
The other questions, the other questions relate mainly to NATO and NATO's response.
Okay.
Whether we should have a no-fly zone and so forth.
Okay.
Whether there are questions about whether the Ukrainians and Europeans did not take the US warnings seriously about an impending invasion, because Biden has really revealed a lot about US intelligence leading up to this crisis. And I think there are several questions about Ukraine's expedited accession to the EU. What is possible? How quickly can it happen? So yeah, those are various questions that are out there. You can answer any and all of them, Marie.
Okay, very good. It's good. I think we are broadening in the sense of, I will start with the those questions from the audience, and then go back to the problem of Putin, Putinism, the Putin system, as briefly as I can. Will, please raise your hand if I'm being a bit too long. First thing, I think I can say this as a European French citizen, it's that this rapid map to the EU must be offered as well to Georgia and Moldova. They are asking this. As you know, Moldova, because of Transnistria and because of Romania, one east, one west, are on the front line. So it is, and it's going back to what I analyzed earlier. We can no longer accept, because we're cowards or lazy, or because we are easily deceived by propaganda and Putin's threats, we can no longer tolerate a zone, an interzone, where states have weak sovereignty and societies, institutions have no future. So I think this is what comes out clearly today. Yes, we will do it. I have absolutely no doubt we will do it. And we will do it because we, the EU, are always better and stronger when we make collective decisions than when we wait for 27 countries and parliaments to make decisions, add them up, and have no veto. Remember the sanctions that we've been voting in the EU without any discussion, without any veto, every 6 months since the spring of 2014. And I remember at the time, most American colleagues, journalists would not believe me when I was telling them not to worry, they will be voted and re-voted. The second question that I think is important, and where I would like to have also your contribution, is the question of diplomacy. We, the French, the Germans, the EU, NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, the US, we have been trying to respond to Putin's demand for high-level summits, diplomacy. As you well know, he was never ready for a real dialogue or for negotiations. This man, for years, is incapable of making a concession or a step forward. That is, with his state of mind, he will always want to be right rather than win. And this is the very weak point of troubled personality. So coming to this, yes, I think, as Andrew said, existential mode. For years, we know that they are in survival mode. Otherwise, why would they try to kill, imprison, harass deputies, journalists, opponents, disloyal governors? So in this survival mode, it's so much, the leader and the leadership very much depends on the context, because they become vulnerable to external factors. And this is where it is already, it is today impossible to predict. All we know is that the pace of the fall is accelerating. It is accelerating. And we know that if the man and his closer clan do not fall, it will be absolutely dramatic for Ukraine, for the Russians, and for all of Europe. So just about, and you ask about the system. I think a few years ago, when all of us and Andrew and I would write about Putin, the Putin system, can the system survive Putin? This is obsolete now. That was an intelligent question until Donbass 14. I think today, I mean, they've cut all the ropes. So it will be Putin and his clan. And this is why, on this infamous Monday, the 22nd of February, he took them hostages of whatever he was gonna do. Last point, and then I promise I will not have to say a word, is this thing, it's going on in France now, and I wonder if that's going on in other countries and in the US. Some say that to go too far into desperate diplomacy with Putin was not a way of helping him. First, because he is an FSB agent. That's how he was, KGB agent. That's how he was trained. So to have, like the French president for 5 hours plus 2 hours of press conference and talks and things, they wanted also to get information from the state of mind of the French president, his entourage, and have a sense of the political vulnerability. So I think that would be for another discussion of how not to do unprotected diplomacy and summit meetings with a dictator who is threatening war. This said, I believe that Emmanuel Macron is right to keep a link to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin.
Thanks very much, Marie. I saw Andreas scribbling very, very frantically, so I'm going to give him the floor as well, and then we'll return to Andrew. So Andreas.
Yeah, I don't know what to answer now, in addition to what Maria have said on Putinism. Yeah, Putinism for me is, again, I would not say that this is something very specific Russian, and Russians are, in some way, victims of their history, and always they will stay with some kind of, Lenin, Stalin, Putin, and that's their destiny, Yeah, unfortunately, Russian history is very harsh, for Russian people, first of all. And I'm always saying that, I believe in Russia, in Russian people who are really European people. They are European people, but unfortunately their history played, very, very bad games with them, very tragic games, Always all the, European developments were coming into Russia very late, with very long delay, sometimes very tragic delay. They were trying to repeat, French Revolution during whole 19th century, and they ended in 1917 with Bolshevik Revolution. And that is a tragedy now. And then the tragedy which really, costed a lot of, blood and everything, victims to everybody, but, the biggest victims were Russians. Now this war against Ukraine again is bloody, bloody history, event, which is really takes, a lot of blood from Ukraine, and a lot of victims, but also, Putin really made a very big crime against Russian people. And but at the end, I am coming to a very simple conclusion. I do not see any reason not to believe that Russian people would not be successful with real democracy. That they failed with Yeltsin democracy, that is nothing, nothing very special. If you will see into, history, into post-imperial, countries, and, so-called democratization theories, I was very much heavily influenced by Samuel Huntington, third wave book, So you will see really that it looks like that he was writing about Russia, despite the fact that he was not speaking about Russia too much, And so, well, I don't know, maybe I am naive optimist, but I see really that Huntington was right in such a way that, the country which becomes democracy first time, usually that democracy is not able to stabilize, especially in such country like Russia. But also, perhaps Huntington was correct when he said, that in 1990s we were facing the third wave of democratization. And since I came, from physics into politics, well, physics was before 1990, quite many years ago, but nevertheless, like still numbers and some, and some regular, phenomena. And I am saying if we have three waves of democratization, we should wait for, wave number 4. And maybe this wave is coming now, exactly. So that's why I'm saying, okay, Putin is Putin, Putinism is Putinism. It's really very, very, very tragic and very, very catastrophic phenomena. But I see all the, tendencies, and all the historical, how to say, trajectory, which for me brings quite a realistic dose of optimism when I'm looking into how things will develop.
We always like optimism, especially in this part of the world. Andrew, any final comments?
Well, you had, I mean, there were a couple of questions. I won't follow up on that. I mean, I'd be very happy for us to have a session on Putinism on that in due course. But there are two important questions. One of which I think was, why didn't people take the US warning seriously? Well, that's something we'll have to come to. But please bear in mind that the no-fly zone that was the question was raised and is increasingly, I suspect, going to become more and more important as the war escalates, or as the special military operation, if we really must, as the war escalates. Please remember that this is not just a statement of something that we do. Okay, this is an activity with ramifications. What this means is effectively suppressing adversary ground and air defense. And that will have to be both in Ukraine, possibly, but also within Russia. That means strikes on Russia, just so that we're explicit about what this means. That means that we will almost certainly end up in an exchange of fire with the Russians. I mean, let's just be clear about what that means. Not just, why don't we implement it? Why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? As though it's something that can just be done without consequence. So that, if that happens, I hope that our political leaders and our strategic leaders have worked out the second and third stages of that, because that evolves the conflict from a local war to at least a regional war in which we will be involved. So, I mean, to my mind, considerable strategic thought needs to go into that. And there are other questions, but I want to make myself explicit on that point. Thanks, Will, for organizing this and for having us on.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I have one last follow-up question for you, Andrew. So you said that victory must, from the Russian perspective, must include an international treaty. But in light of the demands that Russia has made, that no NATO membership for Ukraine, return to the 1997 NATO borders. Is Russia really negotiating is Russia really negotiating? Is it looking for an international treaty? Or did it just make demands that suggested that it wasn't interested in an international treaty, and the failure of those negotiations led to Putin's invasion?
I think if we take that spectrum of victory and defeat to understand what we might be thinking about in terms of war fighting, we've talked a bit about what political defeat might mean for Russia, or military defeat might mean for Russia. A military victory is the non-resolution of the policy clash between Moscow and Kiev, and there are very obvious and explicit policy clashes between Moscow and Kiev. But that a military victory only does not resolve this. The political victory essentially means, indeed, Kiev accepting the imposition of Moscow's demands, whatever those demands may mean, whether it's the demilitarization of Ukraine, whether it is Ukraine's neutrality or so on. It will depend very much on the situation, the nature of the situation, of how the military aspects of this war play. And an acceptable point to Moscow appears at the moment to be acceptance of Ukrainian neutrality and demilitarization, and written into treaty. Now, that's as I understand it, which is of course the antithesis of Euro-Atlantic thinking. Let's be explicit about that too. So I re-emphasize this point being about a series of policy clashes, not only individual between over Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk, but also about Ukraine's role in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. And that is based on a fundamental disagreement about the trajectory of international affairs, both with the Euro-Atlantic community and more broadly. So it's not just a small thing. It's as I said earlier, it's a structural question. But political victory is the acceptance, in this case, if we're talking about it from the Russian point of view, and we use Russian military and state definitions, it is Ukraine accepting military defeat and signing a treaty which would be neutrality and demilitarization, as I understand it now.
Yeah,
in other words, if I may say, it would be transforming the gray zone into a very, very somber zone.
It would, well, I mean, frankly, Marie, what it would be is the
so it was impossible to even think that we could.
It's the redivision of Europe, Marie. It's where Belarus is effectively an allied state with Russia, and at least a large chunk, if not Ukraine, part of that bloc. So it is the redivision of Europe.
And let's not forget, if I may, Will, that the events in Belarus have been an accelerating factor of Putin's tragic move. You know, what happened in Belarus in August 2020, where he was about to see another dictator fall, and then the repression, extreme violence used by Lukashenko. Now, the proclaimed government in exile by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. This has certainly played its part, and the revolt in Kazakhstan in January. So I don't think there was a big plan, a pattern. There were many possibilities that were certainly discussed in high circles of the military and in the Kremlin, and they have been discussed for years. But I don't think there was a grand design. They are good at taking opportunities, even if by doing so, they are taking huge risks, which is very different from Putin's attitude a few years ago, where he would not go for big risks. And this is what we have to deal with.
Well, thank you very much, Marie. And thank you to all our speakers and to our audience. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all your questions, but I'm sure we will be revisiting this topic as well. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks very much.